let's get to it. Remember what we're doing. I know this is hard. Raina and I were talking before about Archimedes. Where do you stand to move the world? You have to stand on the world to move the world. You have to stand in mythology to analyze mythology. So there's always going to be a paradoxical element at work. That's okay. Kierkegaard said paradox is not a concession, it's a category. But we are analyzing the mythologies of America, the meanings of America, the stories we tell ourselves as a nation that provide our identity as a nation. Now, again, we may think we know these stories, but these stories are always at least partially hidden because that's the way we are in the West, is we keep our myths hidden. You guys, this is like a podcast, right? You're waiting for the commercials to get over in the first 2 minutes. You're very smart. So this is difficult work. We're talking about hidden material, but it appears obvious, right? I don't know if I quoted Jackson Browne. He's got so many great lines, but one of them is, "It's like a song I can hear playing right in my ear. I can't sing, but I can't help listening." Right? That's myth. It's that buzzing in your ear. It's especially buzzing like a bee when somebody's threatening your story. If you have a particular story of America or of you that gets threatened, you're most likely to respond as if it's a threat with fight or flight. And that happens on the national level too. So we're distinguishing between myth as falsehood. We're not really interested in that. There are plenty of myth busters out there, and myth makers, by the way, in that sense, false liars. We are interested in myths as particular stories. That's what we're talking about, the myth of the immigrant nation. That's a particular story we tell, but we're really trying to get to that deeper level, trying to get to that buzzing noise, that background noise, and try to hear it, because it's what affects us. It's what determines our choices in the voting booth, in our profession, in our friends and lovers, etc. All right. The melting pot myth. This is the myth of the immigrant nation. This is e pluribus unum, out of many one. I.K. Paul, in his book, The Myths That Made America, has this amazing description of the melting pot myth that I thought was worth sharing. The melting pot myth produces a vision of national unity and cohesion, yes, through participation in an harmonious quasi-organic community. I don't know why it's quasi-organic, but okay. An harmonious quasi-organic community that offers prospective members a second chance. Oh, we like that, don't we? And a new beginning, we like that, and molds them into a new, quote, race, unquote, a new people. As we'll see, during the founding of this myth, race was used as a synonym for nation, with usually extremely catastrophic results, but that's the way it was used. All right, so we're also talking about what Joseph Campbell said were the four functions of myth, in particular two functions of myth when we're talking about the immigrant nation, the melting pot, the e pluribus unum, which may, by the way, be the shortest myth in history, e pluribus unum. That's nice, right? Campbell has four functions: the mystical, the cosmological. That doesn't really apply here, although it could, but we won't get into it. What really applies here in this meaning of America is the sociological function of myth. Here's what he says. The third function of a mythological order is to validate and maintain a certain sociological system, right? So everybody says, it's society. Well, it is, but there's also a myth behind society that's informing that. A shared set of rights and wrongs, so ethics, proprieties or improprieties, customs, of which your particular social unit depends for its existence. So, yeah, you can study society, but you're really studying myth, ultimately. Or you're not studying it, but that's what's informing and shaping the societal elements. And myth does not exist apart from a culture. It lives in culture the way fish live in water. Myth is invested in a particular set of values found in a particular place. So when we're talking about myth, we're really talking about speech, storytelling, really, on the ground, right? Not some abstract, I mean, we can talk about it in that way, but when we're talking about living myth, we're talking about the stories that are alive and enacted and on the ground, all right? Not in theory or in the abstract. Which is, oh, look at that. That's what I said in my last bullet point. How nice. There's also the psychological function, which you can imagine. The fourth function of myth is psychological, that myth must carry the individual through the stages of his or her life, from birth through maturity, through senility to death. The mythology must do so in accord with the social order of his group, the cosmos as understood by his group. Notice how group keeps coming back here because the psychological function is dependent on sociological function. And the monstrous mystery, which is the ultimate thing that myth is pointing to. And we have plenty of this psychological function in America, one of which is on the Statue of Liberty, the poem by Emma Lazarus. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. It almost sounds like irony today in 2017. Formation of the melting pot myth comes from a Frenchman, J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, Letters from an American Farmer. 12 letters written in the voice of a fictional narrator, a Frenchman in America, like Crevecoeur, back to an English gentleman. And he describes the colonies as they were in 1760, published in 1782. I'd like to give you a flavor of the texts. So, 1760, so before the formation of the government, right? Crevecoeur hears a Frenchman's understanding of this country. What then is the American, this new man? He is either a European or a descendant of a European, hence that strange mixture of blood, which you will find in no other country. I could point out to you a family whose grandfather was an Englishman, whose wife was Dutch, whose son married a Frenchwoman, and whose present 4 sons now have 4 wives of different nations. He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. He becomes an American by being received in the broad lap of our great alma mater, or our mother. Here, individuals of all nations are melted, there's where we get the metaphor, into a new race of men. See, race is nation, but that's how they thought then. Whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world. Americans are the Western pilgrims who are carrying along with them the great mass of arts, sciences, vigor, and industry, which began long since in the East. They will finish the great circle. The Americans who were once scattered all over Europe, here they are incorporated, here they are incorporated into one of the finest systems of population which has ever appeared, and which will hereafter become distinct by the power of the different climates they inhabit. The American ought therefore to love this country much better than that wherein either he or his forefathers were born. Here the rewards of his industry follow with equal steps the progress of his labor. His labor is founded on the basis of nature, self-interest. Can it want a stronger allurement? Wives and children, who before in vain demanded of him a morsel of bread, now fat and frolicsome, gladly help their father to clear those fields whence exuberant crops are to arise to feed and clothe them all, without any part being claimed either by a despotic prince, a rich abbot, or a mighty lord. Here religion demands but little of him, a small voluntary salary to the minister, and gratitude to God. Can he refuse these? The American is a new man who acts upon new principles. He must therefore entertain new ideas and form new opinions. From voluntary idleness, servile dependence, penury, and useless labor, he has passed to toils of a very different nature, rewarded by ample subsistence. This is an American. That's pretty cool, right? I mean, that's pretty amazing. That's at the birth of the country and at the birth of the melting pot myth. You probably already know there are problems with the melting pot myth. Who's in the pot exactly? Who's outside the pot doing the melting? What exactly is being melted down? Is it your actual ethnicity and heritage? And what's supposed to be the result? I love that image. That's an alloy cable, a cable made of metal alloy, which is, again, the metaphor where you combine metals and you create a new metal. Okay, so it's an analogy. All analogies fail. They're supposed to fail. Otherwise, they'd be the thing. You wouldn't be talking about an analogy. You'd be talking about a thing. Fine. And you may have heard people prefer salad. We're a salad. Have you heard that? Okay. All analogies fail. Okay. So here's how the melting pot myth has been contested. First of all, we need to recognize that from 1891 to 1920 was the high point of immigration to America. 18 million immigrants entered the country. And by the way, let me pop this out for you. You can see there that was 15% of the total population. Those numbers don't mean a lot unless you see them as a percentage of. And you can see that in 2010, we're at 13% of the population. So it was high, but it's also pretty consistent. All right. So critics of the melting pot myth say that this really means forced acculturation, right? You're melting down my very identity, which I think Crevecoeur would be fine with, right? You're a new person in a new country. You need a new identity. Let's make one out of your melted old one. And of course, violent assimilation with that peculiar form of immigration called the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade. Americanism sure looks a lot like Anglo-Saxonism, says the critics of the melting pot myth. It's a European, in fact, it's a particular kind of European identity that you're calling new, when in fact it's maybe just a new combination of identities. Interestingly enough, these critics wanted to see this myth fail. And that's an interesting thing, is how and when myths fail. Failure of this myth, to them, means success for the American experiment. One of these critics who argued for the failure of the melting pot myth to mean success for the American experiment was Randolph Bourne. This is 1916. So 1910, 15% of the population immigrants. And he's writing this, 1916, in the Atlantic Monthly. Listen to this. This is really interesting. And it's 100 years old. The failure of the melting pot, far from closing the great American democratic experiment, means that it has only just begun. Whatever American nationalism turns out to be, note that, turns out to be, there's this kind of openness. We see already that it will have color richer and more exciting than our ideal has hitherto encompassed. In a world which has dreamed of internationalism, we find that we have all unawares been building up the first international nation. The voices which have cried for a tight and jealous nationalism of European pattern are failing. From that ideal, however valiantly and disinterestedly it has been set for us, time and tendency have moved us further and further away. What we have achieved has been rather a cosmopolitan federation of national colonies, of foreign cultures, from whom the sting of devastating competition has been removed. Think about that. What we have achieved, where is it, is a cosmopolitan federation of national colonies. I don't like the word colonies, but it was 1960, of foreign cultures, from whom the sting of devastating competition has been removed. America is already the World Federation in miniature, the continent where, for the first time in history, has been achieved that miracle of hope, the peaceful living side by side with character substantially preserved of the most heterogeneous peoples under the sun. Nowhere else has such contiguity been anything but the breeder of misery. I think he's looking at Europe. Here, notwithstanding our tragic failures of adjustment, the outlines are already too clear not to give us a new vision and a new orientation of the American mind in the world. 1916. That was the vision of some people. Okay, so the question here, as you know, is what makes a nation? What are the common bonds that make a nation? Well, I mean, there are plenty of candidates. Language, English only, laws, religion, economics, politics, enemies, we're not them, let's go kill them. Anybody know who that is in the image? Yeah, it's all right, it's pretty obscure. That's Dred Scott. Oh, I see some nods now. Yes, 1857 Supreme Court decision that answered one of these questions, in the negative at least. What makes a nation? Not slaves nor their descendants. The Dred Scott decision was that it was 1857, so it was obviously the descendants of slaves who had been brought from Africa could not, by virtue of being born in America, some 200 years or less after their ancestors were taken did not deserve citizenship. Of course, that was overturned, thank God, but that was the law of the land. And you'll not be surprised that 4 years later, there was a great civil war. All right, what are we talking about? We're really talking about e pluribus unum, which is kind of a philosophical problem, right? Out of many, one. So this goes back to the pre-Socratics, actually. What's the relationship between the one and the many? It also goes to Star Trek, but we're not going to go there. And I know you're thinking that, right? Spock and Kirk. Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. Okay. Plato, of course, is going to emphasize the one. And as often happens when you emphasize the one, the many suffer. And so for Plato, there is one truth, and it is unchanging. One reality, I should say, and it is unchanging. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that you are living in corruption. You are living in change. Therefore, you are going to die. Your body's going to dissolve. You're living out of the truth by definition. You're in the world. All you can do is hope to escape the world. This is a form of Gnosticism as well. For Plato, the only way out is through your reason. You must think your way to the one, which he called the forms. There's also Aristotle, who took the opposite point of view. You find your way through the many. And if there's a one behind the many, fine, but all we have is the many, and we're going to start with the many. And of course, Plato found the one, the unmoved mover. But, as he said, no universals except in particulars. Yeah. He found the unmoved mover. He found the source, Aristotle did. He worked his way back to the source eventually. So, for example, I mean, it's not very satisfying. He said the universe is always in motion. How did it get put in motion? A mover, capital M mover, put it in motion, who itself cannot be moved. Right? Not that satisfying. But it solves the problem, theoretically. So it's about the same difference. It's about what we count as similar. Is this chair similar to the perfect form of the chair that exists in the heavens that's so far above us because we're corrupt? What's the relationship between the two? Right? For Plato, not much of a relationship at all. For Aristotle, yeah, but you need a lot of other chairs to understand chairness. Right? I'm actually getting somewhere with this, believe it or not. Yeah, it's about stasis versus flow. So notice that Plato, who's concerned with the one, is also concerned with stasis, the unchanging. To change is to be corrupt, according to Plato. The truth, the ultimate reality, does not change. It is static. And I'm asking you to think about this in terms of the immigrant nation, of course. What is a nation? Is a nation static or is it dynamic? Flow is movement. As Aristotle said, everything is in motion. Sure, maybe there's an unmoved mover somewhere, but it doesn't really matter because we're moving even as we talk about this, right? What is a nation? Is it flowing? Is it open? Okay, there are critiques of both of these, but generally, the static approach, the nation as closed, and I mean that closed in many ways, is a conservative viewpoint. And I'm not even being political there, I'm just being etymological. To conserve something means to keep it from changing, right? So the conservative, broadly put, viewpoint is to stop the change. Sure, maybe there's a hypocritical element if you're an Englishman in New York in 1859 and you hate the Irish coming in. That's okay, because you have now found the one, you see, and they're the many. So you got to keep the one static and unchanging, and the many, the corruptible, out. Progressive, on the other hand, again, etymologically means to keep moving forward, to keep the nation and the definition of the nation open. Well, that's a hard thing, right? It's hard to live in time. It's hard to live in flow. But Heraclitus said all things flow. But it's still a philosophical problem. How do you define something that's moving? Right? How do you? Other than to say it's moving, which means you're going to have to redefine it. Well, anyway, I don't want to get into that. But meaning in the flow model is achieved, well, in fact, in all models. Meaning is achieved only through difference. I originally had a whole thing here on structural linguistics, and I decided I didn't want to do that to myself or you tonight. So I cut it in interest of time, but if you're interested, sometime we can talk about linguistics and how meaning happens in communication. For thousands of years, since Plato and his dialogue Cratylus, we thought that words were anchored to the things, right? The chair connected to the chairness. A Swiss linguist named Ferdinand de Saussure showed pretty definitively that that's actually not how words and communication works. Words work by being different from one another. Difference makes meaning. Cat is a different word from hat because it looks different. And that's how the system works. Again, I don't want to inflict that on you. You can ask about it in the question period if you want. But I think you know the gist behind it is that, imagine a deck of cards with all aces of hearts. What's the point of that, right? What would you do with that? There's no difference in the system. Imagine a traffic light that was green, green, and green. Systems don't work like that. And I'm suggesting nations don't work like that. Because humans are involved in both language and nation. And in fact, let's take the conservative point of view, small c conservative, and let's say, no, we're going to make this nation, and there have been hundreds of attempts to do this in our history. We're going to stop the nation right here. Okay, it stops right here. All right, we'll let the Irish in, but no more. We're going to stop right here. This is our nation. No Eastern European people, especially Jews. Nope, sorry, we stop right here. How do you think that works out? You think that eliminates difference? Difference is part of the system. You cannot eliminate difference. You can only ignore it or try to make it illegal. Difference is the nation. It is the system, which means that it is open and that it is flowing. And that's why it's an American experiment, not an American fact, not an American entity, static and unchanging. I mentioned this last time. By the way, that's Jasper Johns. Where's Emily? Another Jasper Johns. Isn't that great? It's an American flag with like scribbles on it. Mikhail Bakhtin, as we gaze at each other, two different worlds are reflected in the pupils of our eyes. We need the other whether we acknowledge it or not, I'm not really taking a position here politically. I'm taking a position epistemologically, how we know. How do we know? We need the other to know. So imagine two people sitting at a table, facing each other, and they look across and they see the person, and they see what's behind the person, and that person can't see what's behind her, and so she needs that person to fill in. Bakhtin calls it consummate her world, to see the whole world, because you can't see the whole world alone. You can't. You need the other, right? And that also implies dialogue, right? You have to share what each is seeing. And remember, you're seeing different things, all right? So it's really two worlds coming together, merging, and that is very much like America. That is America. The difference is in the system. You can't eliminate the difference. Though we try, so many stories we could share. But I want to tell you one you may already know. It happened in 1939. Do you know this story about the USS St. Louis? USS St. Louis, a ship that was carrying Jews to New York. 1939? They had sold everything to get on this ship. And it was turned away at every port. New York sent a cable saying, we won't accept you. So it went to South America, it went to Cuba, it went to Florida, it went up the East Coast. And they would not accept a shipload of Jewish refugees, our country, in 1939. You know the ending of that story. It had to go back to Germany, and those people are gone. What's the myth? The myth is, we're done. No more of you. No more difference in the system, right? And yeah, the myth is so powerful, you're going to have to pay for it with your lives. Now, I've been accused of being dark. So, I want to end a little lighter. I think one of the great things about America is that we can take our myths and make them into restaurants. The world's best cheese. All right. Thank you for putting up with me. Okay. So yeah, what we're doing is the myths of America. In fact, we almost called it the myths of America, but I was afraid people would think it was something else. So we're doing mythology, and that means stories, not false stories, but particular stories like the melting pot, but more importantly, stories that are true in that they motivate us to act and believe and to speak. These stories are difficult to unearth within us individually and within us as a culture. They are therefore almost always hidden, but nonetheless very active, because we get pissed off when you start messing with our myths. Yeah. Okay, so I'll stop there. We also talked about the sociological function of myth, which is to form groups, including nations, and the psychological function of myth, which is to provide an identity within the group. How's that? Okay. Sure, Stephen.
I wonder if I want to know more about that linguistics thing that you skip over.
All right. So again, Plato's Cratylus, and for thousands of years, the idea was that a word was actually participating in the reality of the thing. Now, I know Plato was brilliant and all that, but that's really stupid, right? But how can a word participate in the reality of the thing it represents? How can the letter C-A-T, well, it wouldn't be that in Greek, but how can the letter C-A-T participate in catness, right? How do those letters become an annoying four-legged creature, right? They don't, but we believe that for many years. And there's a reason for that, and it has to do with religion. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so we've got this logos notion, this notion as Word, as ultimate reality, and also communication device. Yeah, the Greek letters and the Greek sounds, which Plato would do. He would totally do that. The only language is Greek. Yeah, well, yeah, he's trying to dispense with all that. Logos over mythos, myth. Truth over myth. Which is why you would go there, right? To establish truth. Static, unchanging truth through language. Yeah. Dean, did you have? I'm sorry, I can't quite. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Which is why we're talking about words, yes. 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 Lynched. There were Italian lynchings. Yep. Yeah. 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 Yeah, really good question. Really good question. It's fascinating. So what would be some of the markers you would want, right? If you're say you're an Irishman who's come over and you haven't been killed or conscripted into the Civil War or into indentured servitude, let's say, okay, you're in New York, you're okay, you're alive. What sort of markers do you want to change to become an American? You want to change your accent. You want to change these index features, right? You want to dress like these external things, right? Which is why, well, it's why race becomes such, it's one reason why race becomes such an issue in America, because it's something you can't change, right? You can change your accent, your language, your clothing, your manners, but you can't change the color of your skin. And so it's an eternal marker. It's like words, it's a completely arbitrary marker. What's skin color got to do with anything? It has absolutely nothing. In fact, there's no such thing as race. There's no such thing as race. Ask any geneticist, any biologist. But there's a thing called racism because it's an index feature that can be used in the service of a myth, right? So I don't know if I answered. Did I?
Yeah, but I mean, it comes back close to, I think also such a example is going back to the legacy from the American farmers and the fact that for, and this, each one of those was clear that the race for him also, I would say, is really thinking more Anglo-Saxon.
Yes.
He's thinking more Europe. And
Yeah.
and the race is not, there is nowhere in that language that it talks about any other geographic area besides Europe.
Right. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's an excellent point that I didn't get to, which is how do we treat native people in this myth? You don't want to talk about native people in the immigrant nation because that makes you the immigrant, right? And of course, the African American, right? I mean, okay, forced immigration? Wait, what? How's that work? And then you immediately deny their humanity and the Asian, yeah, Chinese. Exactly. Exactly. So much good stuff here. So where does the myth leak, right? It'll leak with the economy. So if you need cheap labor, okay, you can come in, but be sure that you're not participating in these other elements of the myth, these other functions of the myth. You have one function: build a railroad, pick cotton. Okay, Charlie. Yeah.
Well, we came here seeking religion.
Right.
And you got to go back to Germany.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's later, but I'm just thinking about participation in the definition of a nation.
Right.
Building language, right?
Right.
I wonder if we should, if it's okay for someone to say there is one language in the nation, because then you start talking about the terms of all those things we described: economic, politics, common enemy. The idea that when you come and participate in a nation means we need to participate. We need to bring something to that
Yeah.
to the table and say, okay, this is our common understanding.
Okay.
We're going to speak English. If they had to use religion as a binding force, which I think was poorly done to say the least, you start to develop an identity based on, I don't care where you're from, if you speak the language. When you introduce race, it's another wild card.
Right.
You know, because now you're saying, well, we're all, it's the classic five guys in a row, one saying, I'm Irish and I'm proud, I'm French, I'm proud, I'm English, I'm proud.
Yeah.
You know, but then when the black man walks in the room, they're all like, well, we're white. You know, we're all
Yeah.
backwards out the door.
Right.
But I think that there's something you said, even as far left as I go, I was raised by a woman who, her native tongue was Spanish. My mom, immigrated to the United States, went to school and college.
I didn't know that.
Got her degree at UT, met my father, taught English. She would be the first one to say, speak English or die.
Sure.
This is a Peruvian woman
Sure.
who says, you come to this country, you learn the language, and you take the test in the language, and that's it. So I've been embracing that as much as I've embraced all cultures. I think, what are these things that make our nation? It's not religion. I mean, that's out the window for me. I think
Yeah.
laws are important. You can make laws. That's the way it is.
Yep.
You got to follow the law to keep it together.
Yeah.
And that includes natural laws and everything else that goes.
Does it include the Dred Scott decision?
There it is. Who does it?
Does it? That was a law that defined someone as outside.
But I think that was based on religion. Again, I think that the religious sphere of and the perception of what we don't understand
Sojourner Truth, too.
Right.
Yeah.
So what, do we have to participate at a certain level, and what does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Where do we decide? Do we have to decide? Does our decision have to be final? That's all I'm saying.
Well, we're beyond either, you know, it's never going to, we're never going to put it back together.
Right.
So
Well,
we
it's,
need law.
you're right. It's not going to be religion. I don't think.
We have a great constitution.
Exactly. And that's why it's open. America is an open totality. It's a paradox, right? Feel free to disagree with me, but if you disagree with me, I'm going to ask you what America is. Is it what holds it together and makes it a nation? And that in itself determines immigration, right? And who is and who is not America.
Fear, I think fear is holding it together in this day and age, unfortunately. You know,
Well, that's always worked well for us, hasn't it? Yeah. But do you want to elaborate on that, or are you just kind of moaning out loud?
I mean, I think we're building a wall because people are afraid of what's coming, right?
Yeah, the wall is one of the most mythological things we've done in America since the founding. I mean that because it has no practical use, it has symbolic use.